I think it's working, yes, so let us begin. Welcome everyone, welcome Judith Butler. It is an honor, a great honor and a pleasure to host you here. And in order to give voice to what I think we could call the public happiness of having you here, I will immediately give the floor to Professor Pier Giorgio Donatelli, the Director of the Department of Philosophy, who will address a greeting and express our common welcome to you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Francesco. It's great to have all these students here in this room. So it's really a pleasure. Also, the physical setting of this conference in our park, in the beautiful park of Villa Mirafiori. So thank you so much for being here. It's obviously a great pleasure, a great honor to welcome Professor Butler as visiting professor at Sapienza and at the Department of Philosophy. And I won't say anything as a matter of introduction. In the first place, everybody here know your work beautifully, but I just remember that you are one of the most important scholars and public figures who has actually shaped herself the global conversation on gender and on key issues relating to democracy, political violence, and vulnerability, among others. And she has helped to redefine ethical and political philosophy along her interpretation of subjectivity, emphasizing, as we know, performativity and also the opacity of the subject. I remember a few books. Gender Trouble, published in 1990, was simply groundbreaking. So it simply opened the language within the academy, within the scholarship, and outside in the society, which is still working now its way in our societies in various ways. And she criticized essentialism and defended performativity as a means of constructing the concept of gender. And she has returned to this topic in many other books. And so I only recall Bodies That Matter in 93, Excitable Speech in 97, that was really helpful to me, thank you. Here I say this in public, on hate speech, on pornography. So that was the moment in which a kind of defense of feminism and against pornography obviously was a very conservative move to make. So thank you, Judith, for this. And then Undoing Gender, 2004. And most recently, maybe just saw it, actually was in Hopkins and bought it, Who's Afraid of Gender, so maybe a couple of months. Let me say just a word about this portion of her work, which also extends, as I said, in the redefinition of crucial themes in ethical and political philosophy. So I think the debates around gender and sexuality, as we all know here in this room, have been born out of struggles against various sorts of oppressions, which these struggles, social movements, public conversation, have helped to redefine along the open spectrum of the contestation of binarism and patriarchy. And they have produced, certainly like in this country, more freedoms that we can witness in the forms of life, the language, and the laws of Italy and many other democratic countries. But they have been violently resisted. And along these issues, the conservative front has redefined its identity, which is, I think, a striking fact. Maybe it could be somewhat surprising. So I think it is significant that in the language of the far right, now all over the planet, which challenges liberal democracy, social democracy, the anti-LGBTQ and anti-abortion platform is the most important political tool, along with obviously the discourse against migrations. But actually the LGBTQ is actually the political language that is used against democracy. And the very term gender has been completely deformed. And in Italy, I say this because Judith doesn't live in Italy, gender actually used in English. So il gender, la teoria gender. So if you say gender in English in Italy, it's basically the language of the Vatican and of the far right contesting basically these kind of claims in the name of the oppressions and the injustices, the aspirations, the joys of many of us. And this is contested as mere theory, as a mere veneer, something merely ideological that can be simply put aside and left aside. So this kind of life of gender theory in societies weaponized and re-employed against the aspirations, the claims that you're making in the early 90s is also a very significant fact that we should actually work on. And I think now the term itself has been so much appropriated by the extreme right, for example, in this country, that its original power and evocations need to be reconstructed from scratch. So this is something very terrible that the far right is doing, but also telling about the significance of our distinguished scholar and public figure that I have here on my left. So we are very grateful to Professor Butler for the work on these issues and for providing venues for reframing ethical and political thought, the intellectual sophistication and clarity of her work, as well as the energy with which she engages the public conversation, are admirable and exemplary. So it is really a great honor to welcome her to our department today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Donatelli, for this introduction. At the beginning, I spoke of honor and joy in welcoming you. Honor is probably the most classic term in academic language, but perhaps joy is the term I feel most appropriate. Your works, your book, and more generally your activity have always also dealt with important and sometimes dramatic themes such as discrimination, oppression, war. But in your work, I also always seem to perceive a yearning for imagination and irony and the breadth, the opening up of different possibilities, and thus of the constant possibility of joy. Also, from this point of view, your work is, for me and for us, inspiring. Under this sign of joy, we have been working with colleagues, students. I want to recall Mattia Fiorilli, who is sitting here, who has helped me and is helping me in the organization of these meetings, and whom I therefore want to thank, and with all the students following the course on your works. And also under the sign of joy, the many colleagues who are present and whom I also greet and thank, welcomed your arrival. It is with a great joy, therefore, that I give you the floor. Thank you very much again for being here.
Grazie. Well, thank you so much. Molte grazie. And of course, I have a paper on gender in my bag, if you prefer, but I was very pleased to receive this invitation, very honored, very joyous to come, because I thought I can actually talk about something other than gender. So
I'm sorry about that.
no, it's perfect. No, in Bologna on the 6th or 7th, I can't remember. I will talk about gender.
Well, you are in a course on the history of metaphysics, so
Yes, well, so gender is always in the history of metaphysics, as we know. Okay. Okay. So I would like to thank the Department of Philosophy and in particular Professor Francesco Valerio Tomasi for the invitation to visit here. In these two lectures, I hope to consider the relationship of Hannah Arendt to Franz Kafka's work in developing her idea of the thought experiment, and then to consider a parable by Kafka on the question of law, a work less known than Before the Law, to consider how the parable works to illuminate a critical theory of law, At issue, of course, is how illumination works for both writers, but also how a certain imaginative displacement of known time and space can produce a reflection on the logics that pervade our everyday understanding of time, space, politics, and law. Although the title of my lectures suggests that I will be talking about judgment, I hope to save that for our seminar tomorrow, or questions and answers. The work I will present is a precursor or a prolegomenon to a future consideration of judgment. Hannah Arendt writes on Kafka on several different occasions, but perhaps the most extended consideration takes place in her preface to Between Past and Future. In some very important philosophical sense, she is seeking to understand there the interval between past and future, one that we tend to call the present. We tend to call it that, but do we know what we mean when we use that term? Are we naming something, this now, or does the indexical use of language miss the phenomenon to which it points? This is, of course, the concern, not only of Hegel in his Phenomenology of Spirit, when he writes about the now and the here, two fundamental units of time and space. Hannah Arendt's concern is slightly different. If the present is an interval of some kind, it is not a discrete phenomenon, but rather a gap, a break in linear time, and so a departure from spatial coherence as well. If we try to use the present as if it is a name correlating to a noun or pointing to a discrete moment, we lose the sense of the present. The present is never still enough to be discrete. It is always passing into the past. The present is never substantial enough to name by a singular now, since by the time that pointing or naming happens, the now has passed and another has taken its place. In calling the present a gap or an interval, Hannah Arendt challenges us to consider what we are doing when, for instance, we diagnose the political present, or ask what the history of that present may be. We have perhaps an unreasonable expectation that the present will be available to us, that we should be able to grasp, track, or reconstruct the way that the present emerges from the past as it is. But ontology fails us here, for the present never appears, in her view, fully freed of the past. Indeed, when we ask about the political present in particular, we are asking what is carried over from the past and what is not. Where is continuity and where is break? For Arendt, the question tends to be what can be transmitted from the past. Indeed, at the outset of her essay on Kafka that introduced her book Between Past and Future, she asks how a tradition or inheritance can be passed on or received if it does not assume a written form, that is, if it is not distilled in a communicable way. Under such conditions, she asks, can there even be a testament to what has happened? The question she considers is formulated by René Char, who is referring to the French resistance when he remarks, and I quote, "Notre héritage n'est précédé d'aucun testament." And so Arendt translates it into English, our inheritance was left to us by no testament. This situation is not like inheriting property from someone who has passed away. This is rather a question of what from the revolutionary past in particular, or the time of revolution, can be passed on. If such a time, the lived experience of such a time, cannot be folded into a written testimony, if it cannot be passed on like property or patronym, then what kind of inheritance or heritage would it be? What comes down to us from the past is preceded by no testament, no testamentary authority. What comes down to us from the past is facilitated by no written or communicable form. Something is not passed down or carried over. And here we meet a limit. We should not expect, in other words, for a succession of events to convey such a past, a revolutionary past. It cannot rely on linear time. If such a past does arrive for us, it does so not by way of a testament or succession or sequence, but in some other way. It would be communicated through a different kind of temporality, one that would in some way recapitulate the break, the interval, the gap that disrupts the presumption of a continuous legacy. Of course, we need all sorts of archives to understand revolutionary times, and we must oppose forms of revisionism when they occur. But what can we expect from the archive? If a revolution breaks with a former time, how does that break become conveyed through time? What form is needed to convey such a break? Certainly, there is no authority who guarantees that transmissibility or certifies what is delivered. Arendt here engages a debate about historical time, even though, as we will see, there is also a religious problem which has to do with the transmissibility of the law and its authority, and with understanding the importance of that break in or from that line of transmission. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you understand me? In French, I once said, suis-je intelligible? And they said, c'est quoi ça? Okay. When Sharp, qu'est-ce qu'elle a dit? Qu'est-ce qu'elle a dit? No. Sorry. I mean, life is so grim, you know? We really need some lightness. Okay, so when René Char is posing his question in 1943, he is writing in the midst of the resistance and recognizing the transient character of what he is living through. Following Char, Arendt understands that this concerted action, which is the resistance movement, is a promising and transient moment of solidarity, of living through something with others. She reflects on Char's phrase in the years after liberation, so from beyond the break in history to which he refers. Resistance leads to overthrow, or can, to revolution, or can, and hence to a new founding. So she is writing in the aftermath of a resistance and the post-war refounding of democracy. Revolution, as we know, is described by her as the political action of the people who, unbound by former law, come together to decide the form of their political world, what kind of form they should give to their common lives. Revolutions are, for Arendt, ways of beginning initiating and bringing something into being. Of course, those who emerge from histories of revolutionary overthrow are still burdened by history, often traumatic history. And so we have good reason to wonder in what sense Arendt understands this beginning, whether it signifies a break in sequence and continuity, an interval of some kind. The now, the present, does not follow in a predictable way from what precedes it. No determinism is at work and no calculation. Even if we maintain that revolutions are always conditioned, no description of those conditions can account for the form of freedom that sustains resistance, the freedom that surges up into revolution, a freedom characterized both by the break with the past and a form of beginning. Something about that break, that new form of making, cannot be explained through schemas that rely on linear time for its narration. To understand revolution, or even to testify within its temporality, one needs another kind of temporal order and the suspension of the usual spatial frameworks for conceiving of the ground of action. I would say the ground of action and the ground of judgment. This question of the ground of action, but also clearly of judgment, will concern us in the second lecture in a few days concerning Kafka's Parable on the Law. If what some call an historical transition, the one that characterizes the ongoing resistance, say, against a fascist regime, is rather understood in Arendtian terms as an interval or even a gap, for something new is introduced into the way we think of history and action, in a way that recalls Rosa Luxemburg's understanding of the kind of spontaneity that emerges from the general strike, understood as unanticipated revolutionary potential. Arendt also seeks recourse to an idea of freedom, one that is bound up with concerted action on the one hand and judgment on the other. Shah seems to tell us that for this most important moment, a moment we find in uprising, in general strike, and revolution, there can be no testament. Worse, after certain forms of overthrow, the sphere of political action can be forsaken as the people return to private life and come to assume a political framework for those lives. For those who are engaged in concerted action to overthrow an illegitimate authority, the aftermath of the overthrow brings with it both disorientation and melancholia. Arendt recasts Shah's and strangely anticipatory form of melancholia. This event, which I am part of, will one day be lost, and there will be no trace, at least no living trace, of what we may call upsurge, interval, or break. Arendt clearly agrees with Shah to the degree that the end of the French resistance and the vanquishing of fascism, for the moment, saw many combatants return to private affairs or to sectarian struggles over who should hold power and at the expense of whom. In the aftermath of resistance, a certain sadness ensues, and whether or not it is fully conscious, there is a kind of mourning or a detour on the path of mourning for those whose entitlements have been restored after the years of resistance. The treasure of those years is nevertheless lost. The time of which Arendt writes has no testament, and yet here is Arendt writing, giving some kind of testament to that time ex post facto, documenting perhaps a kind of political melancholia. But she is aware that she has already lost the moment for which she seeks to give an account. And in her terms, those who took part in the resistance had become challengers and, quote, had begun to create that public sphere between themselves where freedom could appear, end quote. But the task of those who live within that space is to keep freedom alive in the form of action and to revise action in light of its plural and concerted character. Of course, Arendt's idea of freedom is precisely one that cannot be reduced to personal liberty or the prerogative of individuals. Her form of republicanism, as you may well know, is not libertarianism. In her reflections on freedom, she offers a critique of the idea of an inner freedom, which for her is a non-political freedom. She argues that these conceptions have predisposed philosophical thinking about freedom in some seriously errant ways. So she is clear about what freedom is not. It is not, and I quote, an attribute of thought or a quality of the will, end quote. And when she first starts to tell us about what it is, she refers to, I quote, the free man's status, understood first as the freedom to move, the freedom to gather, a freedom acquired by someone emancipated from slavery and into citizenship, the one that, quote, enabled him to move, to get away from home, to go out into the world and meet other people in deed and word, end quote. So freedom first becomes clear in the context in which constraints are thrown off. Freedom, thus, as the absence of constraint. But freedom is also the condition in which the ability to act in public first becomes possible. The constraints thrown off might be any number of constraints: private sphere, the prison, slavery. For freedom to exist, though, there must be a common public sphere or space, as she puts it, and yet that space cannot be created without freedom. So freedom has at least a double meaning. It creates the space and time within which free action can take place, and it is that action that acts in that space, and thirdly, in that acting reproduces the condition of its own possibility. Arendt tells us that action cannot be determined by motives or external effects. So we cannot explain acts of freedom well by reducing them to motives or context or external pressures. And lastly, action can only take place in a common public space. She considers critically the view that freedom may be a principle, one that exists outside the human and is simply instantiated through human action. She rejects this view. For a free action cannot simply embody the principle communicated by an ethical demand from elsewhere. On the contrary, and this formulation is important, I quote, "The inspiring principle becomes fully manifest only in the performing act itself," end quote. Or again, as she writes in her essay on freedom, quote, "The appearance of freedom, like the manifestation of principles, coincides with the performing act," end quote. Right? So Arendtian theory of performativity, Bonnie Honig and others have spent good time explaining that for us. In other words, the principle cannot be known in advance of its exercise, for it only appears in its exercise or enactment. And yet freedom is not simply the punctual manifestation of a principle belonging only to that moment and nothing more. If that were the case, freedom would be acted upon or enacted and lost quickly thereafter. Actually, what is surprising here is that for Hannah Arendt, freedom is inexhaustible. And by that she means open to an infinite iteration, an infinite iteration. It is certainly not that individuals are endowed with an inexhaustible faculty or romantic idea. No, they manifest a capacity in the act, which suggests that the capacity is not the precondition of an act, but rather an enactment within the sphere of appearance, one that admits of its inexhaustible character, thus never fully exhausted by the time and space of its enunciation. Right? So, freedom manifests in its exercise, which seems to tie it to the time and space of its enunciation or enactment. At the same time, it eludes or escapes the specific time and space of enunciation, and it does so infinitely. To grasp this reiterative inexhaustibility, I would suggest one has to understand the rhythm of transience that Schar underscored. Although Arendt's early work on Augustine clearly addressed these issues, the resonance of that early work with other Jewish influences on her work has not been often considered. Susanne Gottlieb, in Regions of Sorrow, a beautiful book, has quite compellingly underscored the messianic character of Arendt's views on suffering and action, noting that the messianic is a schema in which the inner potentialities of action are the only place where we can find redemption. Similarly, Martine Lebovici in Hannah Arendt et la tradition juive cautions against understanding Arendt's status as a secular writer as an accomplished reality. For Lebovici, secularization is not a straightforward process that results in a final and complete accomplishment. It is rather open-ended, bearing the traces of the religious it leaves behind, showing, in effect, that the past is not so easily overcome by a form of secularization understood as the progressive shedding of religious belief. Indeed, in the edited book, Love and St. Augustine, derived from Hannah Arendt's dissertation, supervised by Karl Jaspers in 1929, there is no reference to Judaism in the endnotes. And I searched in vain, only to find a query about why a Jewish woman formed in a secular setting would find in Augustine, especially his ideas about time, caritas, and civitas, a theological topic worth engaging philosophically as intensely as she did. Indeed, that was one of the criticisms at the time. Doubtless, there are many reasons why Hannah Arendt turned to Augustine, and I somehow feel like Professor Tomasi has many ideas about this. But one does not have to belong to a religion to study it intensely. I have to remind people that. Although both Hans Jonas and Karl Jaspers did ask her the question, why this topic, Hannah? Okay. In the Augustine book, she writes, and I quote, "The beginning of life meant our entrance into the world, and its end means that we must leave the world. The reference goes back before the world and before life in the world to what she will call the source of life. The moment of birth is already, for her, transient. Transience arrives with all life lived in time." And she writes further that, and I quote, "Time is not only the index of transience, time itself is transience," end quote. And then, as if prefiguring what she will write in Between Past and Future, nearly 40 years later, she writes, and I quote, "We exist only insofar as we relate directly to the before and the not yet of our existence." Between those two texts, her early work on Augustine and Between Past and Future, Arendt encounters Walter Benjamin, became his friend, sought to help him leave Vichy France, and ended up chronicling his final days and then the problem of time, transition, and ruin in his writings. I'm not saying she left an Augustinian perspective on time for a Benjaminian one, but the inflection surely changes in those intervening years. The Messianic, for Benjamin, also references the source of life, although always indirectly. And to the extent that the divine in divine violence is Messianic, it functions by way of an interval or a break with the time and space of legal violence, the very end of Benjamin's essay on the violence of the law. His theological political fragment is clearly influenced by the reading of Kabbalah in his early years and his conversations with Sholem. There he argues that the Messianic cannot appear or reveal itself in history. It cannot be revealed in time, precisely because it does not belong to the kind of time presupposed by revelation. This claim is repeated in another register when Hannah Arendt insists that the central moments of both resistance and revolution are not revealed in time because they constitute a break with that very temporal order. So at least at this stage, the Messianic in Benjamin's work is described as the traversal of one temporal modality by another. The Messianic, in fact, marks the failure of anything historical to signify the divine, which is one reason why the Messiah cannot be an historical instantiation of the divine. That was, of course, Kierkegaard's question, but not Benjamin's. The Messianic in Benjamin is always and already refused as a human figure. Indeed, the Messianic proves to be the limit and dissolution of the human figure. It is described, in fact, as the recurrent and rhythmic downfall or falling away that characterizes the transience of all living beings. The eternal thus traverses the transient without ever becoming transient and losing its status as the eternal. In the Theses on the Philosophy of History, written 2 decades later in 1940, it is the history of the oppressed, for Benjamin, that flashes up within present time, disrupting its temporal continuity and contesting its progressive claims. And in both the political and theological registers, we are asked to understand how one time traverses another without becoming absorbed and contained in or by the time traversed. And though the focus changes in the 21-year interval between these two essays, from eternity to the history of the oppressed, both modalities are referred to as messianic for Benjamin, meaning a traversal or a breaking through of one time into another, producing a problem for causality and narrative alike. Indeed, I think another way to understand this idea of breaking through of one time into another would be to consider Marx's 18th Brumaire, where temporality takes on this complicated character as well. But this all brings me to my question about Hannah Arendt. Is the Messianic operating in her work? And if so, how? And does it illuminate this idea of the interval with which we began? The interval to which she referred gives us, I believe, a clue to understanding how a messianic interruption or cessation of time works. And here again, I build upon Susanna Gottlieb's important work, Regions of Sorrow, where she shows how Arendt took up messianic notions from her interlocutors to expose the possibilities of both failure and renewal in the sphere of freedom, action, and politics. Hannah Arendt turns to René Char to make her case in between past and future, marking that interval that cannot belong to any version of linear time. Indeed, the title poses the problem. What, if anything, is between past and future? In the dissertation work on Augustine, it is our human existences that are to be found there. But as Arendt further doffs the Heideggerian influences, throws them off, she comes to understand the interval as the upsurge of freedom, something he would not have done, as well as a break with what she calls rectilinear time. When freedom emerges or appears, it's not the simple reproduction of a precedent or the instantiation of an already established model. I hope I've made that clear. Freedom is defined in part by its unprecedented character, which is to say that it is always defined in relation to a temporal novelty. Strictly speaking, it is the effect of no cause, but rather an infinitely renewable exercise. Infinitely renewable, not for me, not for you, but only because it is not the property or expression of the individual, but rather because it emerges from the relation between us, perhaps a relation that one would be right to call a covenant rather than a contract, belonging to what she called civitas. That relation is also an interval, a break in the line, and we still have to understand in what way this breakup of rectilinear time relates to what is inexhaustibly free, that is, unconditioned and unforeseen. Hannah Arendt's turn to Kafka is an important one at this juncture. And I'm struck by the way that the transience that Char laments in the midst of the experience of resistance, which should be, I suppose, an absorption in vitality, with what Benjamin says about what is eternal in transient life. Benjamin notes not only that this life is transient, but that all life is transient, underscoring that transience as that which recurs in this life and in all other lives or living processes. This recurrence of transience is not transient. No, it is, in fact, eternal. It never ends. And it constitutes at least one reiterative version of the inexhaustible. So let us remain, if we can, with this thought. If the recurrent character of transience is eternal, meaning that it has neither beginning nor end, then the recurrence itself is not transient, even though no description of transience can do without it. There, I've been properly metaphysical. I just want that. Okay, I've added something metaphysical to sapienza. Okay. However, the recurrence that characterizes transience requires the multiplicity of transient beings or transient processes in duration, since without that multiplicity and duration, there would be no recurrence or reiteration, and so no punctual condition for what Benjamin calls the rhythm of transience. That rhythm seems to inform and exceed all transient things, and that situation does not cease happening, or rather, it would only cease with the destruction of all things transient, that is, when all transience has ceased. So as long as there is transience, there is this rhythm, although God knows we cannot always find it. Although awkward and arguably painful to find eternity in the passing of life, it strikes me as significant, since it's not an appeal to an afterlife, and though it is immanent to life, it is also not the same as human time. It is the eternal feature of what continually passes. Benjamin's formulation clearly differs from the Heideggerian focus on finitude, the idea that no one can die for me, that in relation to death, I am non-substitutable, a fact which illuminates my finite singularity. Benjamin suggests that my passing, or the passing of others, has to be understood as a recurrence and even a rhythmic one. Every instance, no matter how singular, is a recurrent moment. In Benjamin's piece on the rhythm of transience, Philosophical Theological Fragment is where we find that. I'm sorry, I hope that's the right name. We are asked to understand this process of transience or downfall, Untergang, as a rhythmic recurrence, one that he calls a form of happiness. Apparently, once we grasp the recurrent character of our own transience, it is no longer ours alone, but belongs to all living creatures, and the very recurrence becomes, in some sense, musical or rhythmic, a sense of sound that exceeds life itself, the occasion for another kind of happiness, one far removed from the kind that utilitarians have been calculating all these years. Interestingly enough, when Arendt reflects on the kind of social movements and collective action that Schar lives and mourns at the same time, she calls it public happiness. It is a form of happiness that emerges, as it were, between us, not just when we are tearing a structure down, but also when we are building the world in which we want to live without denying its transience. Indeed, for Arendt, as far back as the dissertation, happiness cannot be dissociated from transience. This relation of eternal recurrence, not to be confused with Nietzsche's version, appears in Arendt's own reflections on history and freedom, for in her language, freedom is also inexhaustible. Perhaps we can see here a departure from the axis of Heidegger-Augustin in her early years toward another one, namely Benjamin Kafka in the later years, or at least starting in the 1940s. This reiteration of the inexhaustible departs from rectilinear time. It does not realize a pre-established goal. Rather, it's a process of making or coming into being. And as we shall see soon enough, it also informs her relation to law, establishing her position in a strangely proximate relation to anarchism, or rather an interesting amalgam of federalism and anarchism. Nothing authorizes the break with authority. This we know from Schar. Nothing authorizes the break with authority, and in this sense, the break is a break with established forms of authorization. The interval also appears as a feature of plurality, designating the relation or opening between persons from which concerted action emerges. The interval is precisely the non-foundational source of freedom, its reiterated origination, but also that form of concerted action that is resistance, and that form of deliberate action on the part of a plurality by which a new polity comes into being. For Arendt, the action through which new polities are formed cannot be violent, or should not be violent, even though revolutionary action can be, as she says, accompanied by violence. Indirectly arguing against Benjamin, who thought that all law-making is a form of violence, what he called mythic violence, Hannah Arendt claims that power is distinct from violence and that it characterizes the collaborative and plural action of bringing a new political reality into the world, an action that she claims belongs to a broader principle of natality. Power is thus distinct from violence, and violence can never be creative, or so she argues in her counter-Benjaminian essay on violence, a problematic text for many reasons, including its racist footnotes, that nevertheless offers us a powerful distinction between power and violence. This notion of the interval, crucial to understanding the break with authority, the break with historical continuity, the relation among people as they engage freely in concerted action as part of the space of appearance. This seems to be a transient moment, one that eludes capture. It cannot be commodified or exchanged. It cannot be handed down in a testamentary form. She calls it public happiness, and in some ways, perhaps, this happiness constitutes both the release from individualism without the denial of singularity, This would seem to be Adriana Caballero's point in her excellent book on Hannah Arendt, Surging Democracy. Could such a moment or interval have a name, and can it receive a testament? Well, what has happened can be neither archived nor transmitted, and in this sense there seems to be neither past nor future, only what she calls, and I quote, a sempiternal, late Latin for a never-ending duration, you probably understand that better than I do, sempiternal change of the world and the biological cycle of living creatures within it. It may seem odd to find remnants of theology in the midst of a political philosopher's reflections on time and freedom, on civil disobedience, resistance, and revolution. But that may be because we misunderstand the partial character of secularization and how a ruin can flash up in new form, organizing new concepts. It turns out that to understand this interval, Kafka is helpful, if not necessary. So Arendt turns her attention there. But with that turn to one of his parables comes Benjamin's understanding of parable and its relation to Talmudic interpretation. In the last part of this talk, I will try to explain and then briefly relate all this back to the political forms that Arendt seeks to affirm. In her 1968 introduction to the shocking collection Illuminations, Benjamin's work, collecting Benjamin's work, she writes the following about Benjamin's generation of critics. Quote, they looked upon the dawn of a new age basically as a decline and viewed history along with the traditions which led up to this decline as a field of ruins. No one has expressed this more clearly than Benjamin in his theses on the philosophy of history, and nowhere has he said it more unequivocally than in a letter from Paris dated 1935. Quote, actually, I hardly feel constrained to try to make head or tail of this condition of the world. This is Benjamin writing, okay, it's 1935. Sorry, it sounds like today. On this planet, a great number of civilizations have perished in blood and horror. Naturally, one must wish for the planet that one day it will experience a civilization that has abandoned blood and horror. In fact, I am inclined to assume that our planet is waiting for this, but it is terribly doubtful whether we can bring such a present to its 100 or 400 millionth birthday party. And if we don't, the planet will finally punish us, its unthoughtful well-wishers, by presenting us with the last judgment. End quote. And again, from the same introduction, and this is Hannah Arendt, insofar as the past has been transmitted as tradition, it possesses authority. Insofar as authority presents itself historically, it becomes tradition. Walter Benjamin knew that the break in tradition and the loss of authority which occurred in his lifetime were irreparable, and he concluded that he had to discover new ways of dealing with the past. In this, he became a master when he discovered that the transmissibility of the past had been replaced by its citability, and that in place of its authority, there had arisen a strange power to settle down piecemeal in the present and to deprive it of peace of mind, the mindless peace of complacency. And here she quotes Benjamin, and I quote, quotations in my works, Benjamin, quotations in my works are like robbers by the roadside who made an armed attack and relieve an idler of his convictions, end quote. Benjamin puts it this way when he describes Kafka's writings as citational, quote, Kafka divests the human gesture of its traditional supports and then has a subject for reflection without end, end quote. We pray, we declare laws and truths, but in doing so, we are seeking to recover a time that has already slipped away. The citations gesture towards something both real and lost. Further, for Benjamin, Kafka's prose pieces are not quite parables, he tells us, but, I quote, they want to be taken on face value, end quote. Quote, they lend themselves to quotation and can be told for purposes of clarification, and yet the doctrine that the parables are meant to interpret do not exist, so we are left with an absent law, and parable no longer serves the function of showing us how to live in accord with the law, end quote. The law has become lost, or it has never existed, but in relation to which, nevertheless, a number of parables and interpretations abound. And in Kafka, at least, parables become primarily about the absence of law. They meditate on the absence of law. And legal fiction emerges as a nearly dominant genre, nearly obsessional. In Benjamin's essay, What is Epic Theater?, we find the interval emerging again as the interruption of the play, the destruction of Aristotelian requirements that events proceed according to rules of likelihood and probability. Benjamin then writes that in Brecht, interruption goes, quote, beyond the sphere of art. Interruption is one of the fundamental devices of all structuring and serves as the basis of all quotation. The interruption of context is meant to bring a bourgeois world into relief, which would otherwise continue to replicate itself more or less mindlessly in the service of a questionable ideal of progress. So Hannah Arendt regards this interruption of a questionable ideal of progress, a presumption of forward time, as crucial for understanding what freedom is and what freedom does. Freedom interrupts, it breaks, and it makes. So what I'm calling upsurge or surging, following Adriana Caballero, breaks open linear time, the reproduction of the bourgeois ordinary, with promise and sorrow at once. It is a predicament, one that Arendt believes that Kafka has approached in his parables. She tells us about a Kafka parable that is simply called He in its English publication and remains untitled in the German. It's about the past and future as forces that are acting upon a man. He is pressed from behind and blocked from the road ahead. He's not only blocked from behind, but from the origin, which suggests that he has always been blocked, or that the origin has always been blocked from him. The second blocks the road ahead. There's a second figure blocking the road ahead, which means either the man cannot go there or that the road itself preemptively ends. The man battles one way and the other. This force from history supports him when the future is pushing, and the force from the future supports him when the force from history is pushing. He's pushed forward and driven back. He seems to have no center, no gravity, no way of holding still or firm. He's always being pushed from the past or from the future, and he is pushed this way and that double motion is his motion. Right? He seems to have no center of gravity. Then an odd statement is appended to the description by Kafka. It is only theoretically so. He reminds us that this is an act of theoretical speculation, in case we got terribly worried, I suppose. As if to explain what is meant by this recourse to theory, Kafka writes that there's a third person in the scene, the man himself, and who really knows his intentions. And though we cannot know his intentions, apparently, Kafka does proceed with some confidence to tell us what he dreams. Perhaps because that way we learn something of his wish. His dream, though, the man's dream, is that sometime in an unguarded moment, and this would require a night darker than any night has ever been, he will jump out of the fighting line and be promoted on account of his experience in fighting the past, fighting the future. He will be promoted to the position of umpire over his antagonists in their fight with each other. So the man who's pushed this way and that has a dream that he will jump out of this particular sequence and he will arbitrate the struggle between past and future. So the parable imports an impossible time. This unguarded moment is one that would require a night darker than any night has ever been. So this darkness does not belong to the darkness of nights that any of us have known, or that is in fact knowable. Indeed, in another parable called The Coming of the Messiah, Kafka refers to the last day, which is not the last day of any calendar, but the very last day, suggesting that the day he has in mind is the one in which calendar time comes to a halt. Similarly, perhaps, this night, the night in this parable, belongs to another order of darkness, one which would permit the man in the middle to dream that he steps or leaps out of line. The line is a particular figure here, since of course there is a line of three bodies, the man pushing from behind, the man blocking from ahead, and the man who is the man in the middle, pushed and blocked from at least two directions. It's a strange kind of line and lineage, maybe a patrimony or a patrilineality, maybe a line of another order. So if the dream of the man in the middle, who is in some sense representing the present between past and future, is to jump out of line, then the dream is precisely to leave this particular lineage, this héritage, this patrimony, to exit this tradition or rectilinear time. That middleman with the dream wishes that someone with authority would recognize the man's experience in fighting, make him into an arbiter, a judge, an umpire. But there is no authorizing power to be found. There is, however, a dream of breaking the line of this bellicose impasse to enter into an adjudicative role, a position of deliberation and power, a judge, one who can and will exercise judgment. Yes, all this is but a dream, one that the narrative voice claims is the man's dream. And Hannah Arendt comments that if the mind cannot induce reconciliation, it finds itself engaged in warfare. Is the man wishing to reconcile the warring partners? Does their struggle continue without the man in the middle? These are open questions, perhaps unknowable. But let us remember that in conflict here, the forces in conflict here are past and future, and the site of an impossible arbitration is the present. But the story does not end there, and Arendt, who accepts that some events cannot be documented, is no longer claimed by forms of existentialism that mistakenly formulate this despair as part of the human condition itself. Arendt, rather, seems here to be looking for an historical allegory that allows her to understand the conditions of action, considered as public and political, and their relation to thinking and to judging. She writes that if an historian were to reconstruct the sequence of the years of the French resistance and then the liberation, he or she or they would have to cast light on a mind that, and I quote, had been forced to turn full circle not once but twice, first when he escaped from thought into action, and then again when action, or rather having acted, forced him back into thought, end quote. In Kafka's parable, the man in the middle is hardly acting. He's reacting one way or another. He's pushed this way and that. Indeed, he's using the force of one push to affect another, and then using the force from the second to push back, kind of like taekwondo. There's no progress exactly. He dreams of jumping out of line and getting appointed as umpire, So there is a theoretical speculation that produces the possibility of adjudication in his mind. Someone who delivers judgment, someone who adjudicates, but who is spatially situated outside the fight itself. So there's a yearning for law and for judgment, but not as an instrument of the struggle, but as a perspective on the struggle. There's a yearning for an authoritative intervention or even the possibility of becoming authoritative. He cannot quite achieve it, but he can dream it or he can speculate about it theoretically. It's unfounded, it's speculative, but it does emerge from this imagining of another space-time or this transport into another space-time. The human figure, we might say in this parable, and I'm almost done, is something of an interval in this back and forth. The dream of jumping out of that timeline would be a way of breaking free, even a figure for freedom. In Kafka, it does not look like freedom is happening, but for Hannah Arendt, it surely can. And Arendt wants to draw our attention to those intervals that seem to be evanescent or even impossible. They carry something of eternal duration in them. The Messianic is not exactly Arendt's language, but something of the eternal, understood as biological cycles, seems to be important here, an ever-generative source of life, as intrinsic dimension of freedom that breaks with the temporal order, unprecedented character of action in both resistance and revolution. This interval of thought is fully determined neither by the past nor by a specific idea of what is to come. We do not have the experience to understand this moment, and whatever moment this is challenges the frameworks that are available to us to understand what the moment is. We might say we are lost or stuck, but it seems rather that we're caught up in the interval itself, experiencing what Hannah Arendt calls the reversal of the established relationship between experience and thought. And this she also calls breathtaking. For Hannah Arendt, Kafka produced what she called a thought landscape or a thought event for, if it is the past and future that clash at the sight of the man, and if the man can only hold ground by fighting them both. Something about the man's continuing presence keeps the two forces from destroying each other, or so Arendt surmises, but we do not know whether, if the man were really to jump out of the line, the fight would continue at all. We can ask that question of life, but not so easily of the parable. Arendt makes that clear, she makes clear that time here is not a continuum, and in this way she nears Benjamin's view. The ground of man is precisely the interval between past and future, and in this way she suggests his standpoint is not the present, but rather a gap in time. He jumps out of time. The jumping out of time is the interval that breaks between that time and this time, that doesn't belong in any continuous way to either time. This gap has already been described as both fleeting and eternal, because transience is endlessly reiterative. So there seems to be ground to ask whether the conceptualization draws upon theological sources and whether Judaism has in fact come into view. Yet even here she seeks recourse to Augustine, who argues that once the finite human enters time, time articulates as tenses, as past and future. So in a strange way, this figure called man has given birth to the past and future by which he is besieged and with which he is embattled. This is not exactly a situation that the human is in, but the temporal definition of the human itself, the time that the human somehow is. Without this human creature, there would not be the past or the future and no fight between them. An anthropocentric vision, to be sure, but one that gathers up the animals once we turn to Kafka. Arendt seems to think that the escape of which the man dreams is the traditional escape into metaphysical thought. But the man's dream is first of all a dream of a stable hierarchy, an authority who could put the man in charge, make him the umpire, and thus attribute to him a position that is both adjudicative and legitimate. There is someone finally who can judge and order the situation, and it will be me. That seems to be the dream, or at least the wish. But actually something else happens, for we are talking about a dream and a parable, and in some ways offering an account of their significance. The two forces pulling and pushing the human figure are both apparently infinite, and they only reach the end of their respective temporal series at the moment in which they clash. Their meeting, their clash, is at a diagonal, meaning that the collision is not head-on. There's a body in the way that redirects and encounters and absorbs its force. In Arendt's view, this idea of eternal change, of inexhaustible and reiterative duration, appears precisely here at the interval between past and future. She writes, and I quote, "The enormous, ever-changing time-space, which is created and limited by the forces of past and future. He would have found the place in time which is sufficiently removed from past and future to offer the umpire a position from which to judge the forces fighting with each other with an impartial eye," end quote. But toward the end of this rich introduction, she seems to take another turn. These intervals cannot be applied to historical or biographical time. She writes, "It is thinking that opens up the access to the eternal, to what has infinite duration. It's neither a modern problem nor an historical phenomenon." She refers to it as this small track of non-time, which the activity of thought beats within the time-space of mortal men, and into which the trains of thought, of remembrance and anticipation, say whatever they touch from the ruin of historical and biographical time. It is precisely this non-time space that cannot be inherited or passed down, the one that explains Schar's statement. It comes to us as a Benjaminian ruin, vibrant and irrecoverable, without the form of a testament and by no authority. In fact, this time and space, out of time and space, must be thought anew by each generation and by each individual. It is, I would suggest, a revolutionary form of experimentation. And if this is what can be neither transmitted nor inherited, then it is also what is operative in resistance, as Hannah Arendt clearly has said. So I will end my remarks with a few open-ended questions. To what extent can we see in Arendt's idea of infinite duration and of an alternate space-time, a theological residue, perhaps, as some have argued, a messianic one? Will Kafka's fiction give us a way to mark the loss of a theological framework within a form of writing that constitutes a vibrant form of melancholy, one that holds to the moment of revolution as the promise or potential of contemporary action, plural and effective? What is this other time and space, neither biographical nor historical, where memory and anticipation meet? Is this a transcendence of ordinary or the furtive potential coursing through the everyday? Elements we set aside only to find ourselves taken by their transport and their promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very, very rich, deep, interesting paper that you offer us. There are many things I think that may be discussed that may give rise to questions or curiosities, and I will open up the discussion. I cannot avoid myself from putting a question to you directly. Your paper was touching many things that lie on my heart, if I may say so. Especially you have described mainly through Arendt and Benjamin and her reading of Kafka, how the gap that constitutes the human condition in the present between past and future generates this eternally transient position. So I am very much interested by this concept. So this link between eternity and transience. Can this eternal transience be seen as an overcoming of the difference between immanence and transcendence? And if so, can we perhaps say that we are not in the presence of a really theological residue, but rather of something like a transcendence that coincides with the very dynamic of time and the human condition and those of immanence? A transcendence, or if I may say so, a God who never exceeds finiteness and who at the same time expresses the sempiternity of the mechanism of finitude itself. Thank you. So my question is on if we can overcome through this eternal transience the difference between transcendence and immanence, because we have at the same time an eternity, and an eternity which is such only in the form of transience. So which is not an eternity such as a presence, such as an object or a substance in itself, like in the old tradition, but a sempiternal changing in the immanent dynamic of time itself.
Well, I thank you for your question. I have two answers to it, and I'm not sure they are compatible with one another, which makes me think that I have not worked this out. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say that in the place of transcendence, there is an exit from ordinary space-time and from historical continuity to a theoretical or speculative zone, which will appear to be transcendent from the point of view of immanence, or when immanence is captured by the ordinary or continuity, but which is actually within the space-time of life. So I think she would, Hannah Arendt would not quite phrase it that way. She would say, okay, what's our historical condition? The historical condition of time thought, not only as a continuity, but as progress. She accepts Benjamin's critique of progress. She also has, as we know, of prediction and predictability, a predictable life. She believes that the unprecedented and the unpredictable are characteristic of freedom, and when we make life too calculated or too progressive or too linear, we are vanquishing the conditions. But that's a political problem, right? It's a problem of what makes for freedom, right? How do we experience freedom? If we identify the immanent sphere with this historical configuration of time as continuous or progressive, are we talking about immanence philosophically, or are we talking about a particular modern predicament of time, where time has been captured and structured in a certain way. And my experience with Hannah Arendt is that she takes a philosophical problem that we associate with time, say, especially in Augustine, and she asks it within the condition of politics or the condition of modernity, right? So it would be hard to answer the question in the language that you provide because she's already adapted that language in another way. So, for instance, the speculative theoretical moment or the parable or the revolutionary moment that breaks with space-time or goes beyond a specific configuration of space-time transcends, we might say, that space-time. Does it transcend time itself? No, because transience is also part of time. So part of me wants to say it can't address that. Another part of me wants to say, but this is probably more Benjamin than Arendt, that at least for Benjamin in the theological political fragment, what is eternal and what is finite, they cross each other, they traverse each other. They don't meet and synthesize, they're not reconciled. There is no reconciliation, but they do cross. And so one time emerges in the midst of another time. So in the midst of this time, there can be experiences that give us some sense of the eternal. And transience, the rhythm of transience is the way we bear, I think. The rhythm gives us a way of bearing transience. The rhythm of transience for Benjamin is what allows us access to something we would call eternal. Does it overcome that or does it reconcile the two spheres? No, it doesn't. So there are several steps to be made between understanding the Benjaminian concept and the Arendtian one. She reads him, she takes things from him, she changes them and adapts them to her own project. And it would take me a little longer than I have to lay out those steps, but I do want to mark the fact that those steps are there.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Is there anyone who wants to take the floor and please, Elettra.
So thank you so much for your very, very interesting contribution. I appreciate so very much this choice to read and reinterpret this text of Hannah Arendt, particularly because this focus on resistance on the text of René Chayr, and of this situation that I think that is also a little our situation, that is to rethink the a possibility of an inheritance heritage, yes, thank you, that could be not reacted. And then my question is, which is then a judgment that is not, as Hannah Arendt said, a mental process, a deduction, that's not an induction, that is not a conclusion, that is not an application of logic norm, of non-contradiction and of coherent, internal coherence, in the sense that what can we, how can we judge in relation to another heritage that is not linear, that is not patriarchal, that is not a patrimony that could be appropriate, but that could be something free in the sense that you have explained. Thank you very much.
It's all right. That was like the future. Thank you for the question. Of course, it's a crucial one. And I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt's book or set of articles that were collected as a book on Eichmann in Jerusalem. Okay. And much of that book is a quarrel with the way in which the trial was held and the judgment was made, a judgment to, in fact, condemn Eichmann to death. And it's a controversial text for many reasons, and I don't want to go into all of those. In the aftermath of that, I mean, she was trying to figure out on what basis should that court decide and whether that was the right court to decide, because it was a court in the state of Israel suggesting that that state had standing to conduct the trial because that state claimed to represent the Jewish people, and the Jewish people were killed by Eichmann. Now, many problems, some of which she didn't notice, which is that many other people besides Jews were also killed by the Nazis and as a result of Eichmann's transport system. She doesn't mention that very much, but I think there's one moment where she does. But there's the question also of why there shouldn't be an international criminal court that would take on a crime such as genocide. And indeed, her reflections on that became very important for post-war jurists as they did develop a jurisprudence for international law that has to make decisions about crimes against humanity or abrogations of human rights. So she didn't want it to be a national, the court that belonged to a nation, and she didn't like the particular argument that the state of Israel at that time gave, that it was the right court. She thought it was not. But she also didn't like the reasoning that the judges used, and she didn't think that they grounded their judgment on the right principles. Later in her reflections on moral responsibility under dictatorship, a quite astonishing essay, I think, which should be read, especially in light of her work on the end of the nation state and the rights of man. I mean, those two together, I think, are extremely important for a critical theory of law. In that reflection on moral responsibility under dictatorship, she says quite clearly that there are instances where the crimes that are committed are unprecedented. And it's hard even to call them crimes because they are not readily recognized as a crime on the order of other crimes we have known. So what happens when there are new forms of crime that are not already typologized or classified? What kind of judgment can be made in light of unprecedented historical conditions and unprecedented forms of atrocity or um, or the radical abrogation of human rights more broadly? And in the case of the unprecedented character of the genocide, the Nazi genocide, she seemed to think that it could not be likened to other genocides in the history of genocide. A comparative legal framework for all genocides was not one that she could think about at that time. So she accepted something about the exceptional and unprecedented character, and certainly within a particular geopolitical space and time, it was unprecedented. I mean, maybe all genocides are unprecedented in some way. So what does a judge do under those conditions? Well, first of all, in light of the unprecedented character, one has to develop norms for judging in the act of judging. So we see a similar kind of argument that she's already made about freedom. And it's not an accident that we see the same kind of argument about judging that we see in her account of freedom. In judging, norms are developed and they're generated. So something in the act of judgment has to be new. It also has to draw on a kind of spontaneity in the sense that it has to encounter materials for which there are no existing conventions, and it has to develop conventions and norms in relationship to these materials. So there's an act of making in the formulation of new rights, new definitions of crimes, new ways of judging. That is actually an ethical obligation on those who are tasked with making judgments of that kind. There's an assumption of responsibility. It's why the moral concept of responsibility becomes important for her elaboration of political judgment or legal judgment more specifically. There's moral responsibility in legal judgment. She's not a legal positivist. She's not an HLA heart person. She would never be that, right? It will never be the case, well, the law is self-sufficient and you could find within the law the grounds for which you could judge any such thing. And she's saying, no, this is not the case. I mean, Ronald Dworkin says that from another position, bringing morality into legal judgment. But Hannah Arendt brings it in, I think, in yet another way, because for her, there is a having to decide and an ungrounded, unprecedented character of judgment. Judgment is, to a certain degree, also a performative exercise that brings about the determination that it must in relationship to the material that it is reading, receiving, considering. So, to answer your question, I mean, one obviously works with prior law or tries to find analogies, but at the point at which analogy breaks down, if it does, then law has to be created. And I think this is extremely important when we look at the Genocide Convention. You know, I mean, I think we currently have a number of debates, like what is genocide and what is apartheid, say. But each of those legal definitions have been expanded over time, and they expand in relationship to new phenomenon. So you can't say, oh, here's this historical example of genocide, and we can only call something a genocide if it approximates or is the same as this historical example. No, genocide has to have a more general features legally so that it can be applied and revised and expanded in relation to new forms of killing. And I will say this about the Genocide Convention, there is a specific category there where the destruction of the infrastructures of life, that is to say, in a military operation that seeks to destroy the institutional infrastructures of life, right, such that people cannot get shelter, they cannot get food, they cannot get health care because the dwellings have been destroyed and the hospitals have been bombed, and famine is now also being induced through certain kinds of military calculations. That is genocidal, and that's in the Genocide Convention. It is not something made up. But the question is, how do you deal with the materials before you in order to show that they comply or amplify the definition in relation to the materials before you, because there are, by virtue of technology, which Hannah Arendt also knew, new forms of killing and new forms of death dealing, which is the term that Talal Assad uses. There are new forms of death dealing, like how do we now revise, expand, or specify the definition of genocide? And certainly also, apartheid is a legal definition which has been revised by virtue of its instances, right? It's not every apartheid regime has to look exactly like South Africa, no. Apartheid has to be a more generalized feature, and I suppose there's a deep pragmatism in this approach to law, but I want to hold on to a slightly different version. I mean, if we call something apartheid, we have to demonstrate why we do, but we have to demonstrate it not in relationship to the precedents, like, oh, this was a form and this is like this other form. No, we do it in relationship to the stipulations that have been established within international law for defining a particular condition as an apartheid condition. So what apartheid has meant and will mean, that's historical. It's the language of genocide, the language of apartheid will always be living in some sense. It will never be tied to one of the instances that exemplifies it. It cannot be. It always has to be detachable from that instance in order, in fact, to be available to a judgment. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Oh, the way in which it's not pragmatism. In and out. The way it's not pragmatism is that it is also linked to this moment of freedom, or what I hear as a kind of odd resonance with Rosa Luxemburg and spontaneity. There is a way in which you're up against something new and you make something, right? You make something, and it involves imagining, it involves choosing. It's an act of generation, of the making of law. It's more like a law-making moment, which we don't always think about judges as doing. We think, oh, legislatures make laws, judges apply laws to various instances, but sometimes judges have to formulate law in a new way in relationship to unprecedented material. So obviously she would not be an originalist or a textualist when it comes to legal philosophy.
We still have space and time for other
Space and time.
questions. Yes,
please.
please come in.
Oh yeah, I cannot.
Because I cannot put it away. So
Yeah, no, I think just.
It's okay, speak
so you prefer to speak up from there? Yes, please.
I wanted to ask about a Benjamin quote in which he says the past tradition is no longer transmittable, but just quotable. And it's not so clear as a concept to me, so I want to ask about that.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think the way to explain it is through thinking about Brecht and epic theater in Brecht. So one of the presumptions is that when conventions have become ossified or rigidified, or when they need to be called into question, they can be cited, that is to say, performed, spoken in ways that actually make them seem out of the ordinary or strange. So the defamiliarization of conventions happens through citation. Citation is not just the act of put quotation marks around a phrase, but in Brechtian theater, it's the way in which you enact a set of words or you enact a certain kind of social convention, right? So how you stand or how the words you speak are don't seem to correspond to the way that your body moves. So suddenly you're hearing and seeing the words in another way. They have lost their ground, even their authorization in everyday life, and they become estranged from us. There's a kind of Verfremdung that he talks about, a kind of alienation from what we take to be most familiar to us. Now, what happens when we talk about progress, for instance, or we talk about democracy, or we talk about justice? Maybe there are received ways of understanding what those are, and we live with those received understandings. But what if our version of justice is, or the one we've come to accept, is actually an injustice? Or what if the progress we applaud is actually destroying our planet? What if the historical time in which we live is one of increasing destruction rather than the building of a better world? How would we occupy the very term where the meanings have become so settled and cite it, put it into quotation marks, meaning seeing it as slightly out of its ordinary function, make it dysfunctional. Don't let it serve a function or an instrumental purpose that it usually serves. At that point, it becomes an object of reflection. It becomes something new, maybe something we can take over in another way or something we can discard. But the whole idea is to call into question critically fundamental assumptions we make about the organization of the world, so that we can, in a Brechtian sense, think about how we would prefer to organize our world or to remake it. And for Brecht, citation is a revolutionary concept to the degree that he has all these middle-class people paying for their tickets to go to the theater, right? And they're like sitting there and they're like, oh, Brecht, he's experimental, this will be fun. Like, oh, when's dinner? Did you make the reservation? Is the babysitter at home? Right. So you walk into the theater, and in fact, there's a reflection of your life in which the basic gestures, the basic things you say, like, oh, is there a babysitter? Is there a babysitter here? Or what time is the reservation? I mean, suddenly, what time is the babysitter? Like, oh, Brett, this is going to be radical. It's going to be so much fun. Right? I'm going to like take in a little radical theater and then go back to my bourgeois life and make lots of money tomorrow. Right? So he's trying to stop you from doing that. Right? He's going to produce a mirror in which your ordinary gestures are reflected back suddenly in a crystallized way, dysfunctional and decontextualized, so that you can see them with some shock, with a jolt of recognition, right? And this is also important for him, jolting the middle class out of their complacency. But we would have to read What is Epic Theater together. It's one of my favorite essays. I'm not sure Brecht is completely right, but I think it's an interesting theory, and it's one that certainly affected Benjamin very, very profoundly, and maybe makes its way indirectly into some of Hannah Arendt's reflections as well.
Silvia Lorusco.
Yeah, she's the boss. She's the boss.
Thank you very much for this lecture. Actually, I have a lot of questions, but just one. I would like to focus again on the relationship between these temporal levels.
Yeah.
Because there's a note in the notebook of Arendt where she actually draws the relationship between time.
Uh-huh.
And I think the year is like 68, but near the publication of Illuminations. And she says, she put together Benjamin and Kafka, and she says that the last conception of time, which takes together Benjamin and Kafka views, is still linear in the concept. It has this gap, and it doesn't have a linear time like the past going this way and then the future going forward. But there's the past that emerges from his side, his level, and the future which comes to the present.
Right.
So there's a collapse of time forces. And I will like maybe to focus on the fact that the past is still in the same direction of the classical conception. It still comes from the past. And I will say that also in relationship to Benjamin's work and Benjamin's inspiration of Arendt, we still have a lot to take from the past. That all these reflections about how to judge, I think everything comes after Origins of Totalitarianism, when she questioned herself about understanding and politics. So the problem that we still have to take the risk to try to understand again a new, extremely new phenomenon, which is totalitarianism, such as a new political and historical event.
Mm-hmm.
And she tries to do this like provocation, I will say, saying that the historical is the new, and that there's no causality between the past and the present, but it's the present and that put his light on the past in a way. So I would like to focus on this relationship and maybe mentioning also the role of imagination, which is the factor that emerges at the end of understanding and politics, and which is actually the medium of all, like the huge life of mind and the problem of time within the life of mind, because imagination is the condition of having a timing relationship with the world, and it's also the condition of anticipation of the relationship with others, and it's also the condition of remembrance. So it is actually what she says in Crisis in Culture, I will say, which is always in between past and future, that the great discovery of Kant in the third critique is not the freedom of the will, it's the freedom of imagination.
Mhm.
So we still have also to question this problem of past and but going maybe from the side of aesthetics and imagination, I will say.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if it's a question.
No, it is a question. Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. I know that you work intensively in this area, so I always appreciate what you offer and what you ask. Thank you. So there are a couple of things. What's odd about the way she talks about past and future through that Kafka parable is that the past is pushing one way and the future is pushing another way, but there's a body in the middle, right? So it's pushing onto a body, a human body, and the past pushes on that body one way. The future is coming back. I mean, the future is oddly going to the present body and pushing it. Now, we could say that's a figure for anticipation or anxiety. But what's odd is that given these strangely mobilized powers, past and future seem to be the site of a conflict that doesn't just take place at the body, it moves the body this way and that way. It accounts for a certain kind of motility and also an ungrounded and oscillating character of human embodiment, right? So ungrounded and oscillating. I mean, it could actually open onto a psychoanalytic account, which I think would be extremely interesting, but she would probably not have had much to do with them, although she makes some admissions in her letters. But so it's very, it's interesting the way there are these figures for time, including the drawing that you make reference to. These two forces can't exactly collide because they are both impinging on the human body. When the human body gets out of the picture, what happens? We don't know. Kafka's parable stops then. Arendt's speculation stops then. So is it only the case that it's the embodied sense of past and future that produces that struggle for this embodied human creature, and always so? And if the human creature gets out of its human form, which it does in a whole lot of other Kafka's, a whole set of Kafka's parables, right? The human is dissolved, or the human becomes Odradek, or the human becomes a set of animals, or we have no human form, or maybe a pure line, as diminished as could possibly be, then that particular conflict also falls away. So I think we have to think about the centrality of the human form in that problem. Of course, Hannah Arendt turns to Kant's third critique right? When she's talking about judgment, she is not interested in the first or the second critique, which is extremely interesting. Why would you turn to something called aesthetic judgment to come up with a way of dealing with Eichmann or assuming moral responsibility under dictatorship? And the reason why is that in aesthetic judgment, you form a judgment in relationship to beauty, or indeed you seek to form one in relation to the sublime, which is outside of the field of objects. You you're dealing with material that is new. You're not talking about reproducible objects. You're not talking about a commodity form even. Although there are forms of art that do obviously work on the commodity form a lot, as we know, Andy Warhol, etc. But she's trying to think about how the terms by which we are judged are also produced in relationship to the work of art. And this is part of the operation of imagination, which you are right is extremely important to her. But imagination is also, to some degree, spontaneous and linked with freedom. And I think that is one of the things that I don't believe has been fully foregrounded in the work on this material. I would also say that what's interesting in the third critique is the idea of sensus communis, which Kant puts forth, that somehow when we are making judgments of a certain kind, we are also participating in a common sense of things or relating to others. It's not like my judgment. There is also a way in which there's an implicit plurality in judgment. So I judge, but I judge in and as a plurality. And I must judge anew, freely, and even imaginatively in order to judge well unprecedented crimes like genocide, or handle politically, come up with political judgments of new political forms like totalitarianism, which she had to do. So we're not just judging someone else's creative activity. We must, in the act of judging, become creative ourselves. I think that's a great place to end. What do you think?
Thank you very much. Time is over for today. I really want to thank you so much for your talk, for your generosity also in answering the question. We will ask you some more generosity tomorrow because we have this dialogical session. So for everyone, we will meet here again tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And so let's thank again Judith Butler for being here. Thank you very much.
Shift gears.